This is my true story. I worked my whole life to build a company, a home, and a future for my family. But one year, it all fell apart. My company collapsed, and one by one, my family walked away. I was left with nothing but memories and silence. Then something strange happened. Something I cannot explain. A voice spoke to me in my sleep, telling me to dig under my father's grave. I did not know if it was madness or fate. Before I share what happened next, tell me where you are watching from right now, and please subscribe so more people can hear this story. I was a young man full of dreams when I first began. I did not have much, only determination, strong hands, and a mind full of ideas. I wanted to build something lasting, something my children could be proud of. When I married, I promised myself I would give my family everything I could. I started small. A single room. A single client. No money to spare. I worked day and night. I studied my trade. I learned everything about my work so I could build it better. I borrowed money wherever I could, from friends, from strangers, even from myself. I believed in my vision. Every day I thought of my family. Every night I worked for their future. I wanted them to never worry about where the next meal would come from, about where they would sleep, about whether they would have a roof above their heads. I wanted them to live with comfort and dignity. I did not take vacations. I skipped comforts others enjoyed. I worked through illness and fatigue because I thought my sacrifice was worth it. Every brick of my company was laid with sweat and pain. Every decision I made was for the future of my children. I built my business slowly, step by step, year after year. I watched it grow from one small room into a thriving company. I thought my hard work and devotion were being rewarded. For decades, I poured my life into that work. I thought my children understood it. I thought my wife understood it. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. The higher you climb, the harder the fall can be. And one year, my world collapsed. It began quietly. A change in the market. A loss of one client. Then another. At first I thought it was temporary. I thought my years of experience and hard work could weather it. But months passed, and the cracks grew deeper. Contracts fell through. Payments stopped coming. Creditors began to call. The foundation I had built with decades of work began to crumble. The people I trusted walked away. My staff left. My partners abandoned the business. The walls of my empire fell silently around me. I fought every day to hold them up, but the storm was too strong. The work that once brought me pride now became a source of pain. I woke every morning to find another part of my dream gone. The company was not just my work. It was my life. And as it fell, I felt my world unravel. But the collapse of the company was not the only thing I lost. Something deeper began to fade. My family. At first, they were still there. My wife and children came to see me. They offered words of comfort, but soon even those faded. My wife became quiet. My children stopped coming home. One by one, they disappeared. The home that was once filled with laughter grew silent. I could feel the distance growing, though I did not speak of it. I still believed they would stand by me. I still believed they would understand the storm I was fighting. But they did not. My wife stopped speaking to me, as she once did. My children avoided my gaze. It was as if the work I had given my life to building was now invisible to them. And then, one morning, I woke to find them gone. The house was empty. The rooms echoed with silence. The air felt heavy, filled with absence. It was not just the loss of the company that hurt. It was the loss of family, the loss of love, the loss of faith that what I built mattered. I sat in the dark of that house for hours, staring at photographs. Old photos of my father. Photos of my children when they were small. Photos of my wife smiling. I remembered the years of struggle, the nights spent working late, the sacrifices I made so my family could live without worry. I thought of the dinners I missed, the holidays I gave up to build something lasting. And yet, here I was, alone. I had given my life for them, and they left me when I had nothing left to give. I felt a deep emptiness, deeper than I had ever known, a weight that no amount of sleep could lift. The collapse of my company was not a single moment. It was a slow, creeping shadow that grew over years of effort until the light was gone. I remember the first signs clearly: a missed payment from a client I had trusted for decades, a sudden silence on the other end of the phone, a contract that was canceled without explanation. At first, I thought it was part of the normal rhythm of business, that I could weather it as I had weathered storms before. But those small losses were not alone. They multiplied. A week became a month became a year. Every time I thought I had repaired the damage, another blow arrived. I began to see my world change. The calls from creditors became frequent and urgent. Letters piled up. Notices arrived at my desk with words I never wanted to read. Final notice. Demand for payment. Foreclosure proceedings. I tried to hold it together, but the weight of these losses was immense. I had always prided myself on my ability to solve problems, to think ahead, to adapt. But this collapse was unlike anything I had faced before. It was not a competitor. It was not a single mistake. It was a perfect storm, a collapse built over time through changes I could not control. Markets shifted, clients changed direction, investments that had seemed secure disappeared overnight. And with each loss, the foundation of my company cracked further. I remember nights lying awake in that empty house, going over numbers in my head, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. I questioned every decision I had made, every step I had taken. I thought perhaps if I had worked harder, if I had been more careful, if I had taken fewer risks, I could have stopped the fall. But business is not built on regrets. It is built on actions. And my actions, once proud and strong, had not been enough. I watched my employees leave one by one. First, those who had been with me the shortest time. Then, those who had given years of loyalty. They walked away quietly, without fanfare, taking their tools, their desks, and their trust with them. I stayed behind, in a building that was no longer mine, surrounded by papers, machines, and memories of work that no longer existed. I thought I could rebuild. I thought I could rise again. But the loss was deeper than profit or property. The collapse of my company was the collapse of my dream. The thing I had given my life to, that I had believed would stand as my legacy, was gone. And as it fell apart, I began to lose more than just a business. I began to lose myself. I began to lose my place in the world. People I once counted as allies stopped returning my calls. Friends who had laughed with me over dinners now passed me in silence. I became a man without purpose. I became a man whose hands were empty. And the hardest loss of all came not from the collapse of the company, but from those closest to me. My family began to leave me. At first, it was small, a missed visit, a shorter phone call, a quiet excuse not to come home. I told myself they were busy, that they did not see the depth of the struggle. But slowly, they stopped coming altogether. My wife, who had once been my greatest supporter, began to speak less. When she did speak, her voice carried a coldness I could not recognize. My children, who had grown up in the shadow of the business I built, started to avoid me. They stopped asking how I was, stopped sharing their days with me. It was as if I had become invisible to them. I tried to reach out, to bridge the distance, but every attempt was met with silence or avoidance. One by one, they left my home. The empty rooms began to echo with absence. The sound of laughter disappeared. The warmth of family gatherings vanished. I was left with the walls of my house, walls that once held joy, now holding nothing but the weight of loss. The silence became louder than any words could be. I sat in my office, surrounded by the remnants of my work, staring at contracts and invoices that would never be fulfilled. I thought about the years I had spent building my company, the nights without sleep, the sacrifices, the struggles, and I realized something I could not escape. The collapse of my company had taken more than my wealth. It had taken the foundation of my family, my wife, my children. They had walked away without looking back, and I was left alone in a world that had once been full of promise. I began to wonder if there was a way to recover. I thought about starting again, but there was no strength left. I thought about calling my family, but there was no answer. I thought about what I had lost, and I knew I could not simply rebuild the old way. Something had to change. I had to find a new path. And that path began not with the business, but with a question. Where could I find hope when everything I had built was gone? After the collapse of my company, I thought the hardest battle was behind me, but I was wrong. The loss of my business was only the beginning. The next blow came quietly, without warning, and it was the one that cut deeper than any creditor's letter or contract termination. My family began to leave me. At first, it was subtle. My wife stayed out later, claiming work or errands. My children stopped sitting with me at the table. I told myself they were busy, that they were grieving in their own way, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. It began with small things: forgotten birthdays, missed phone calls, unanswered messages. I tried to reach them, asking how their days were, offering to help, but the words fell flat. There was no warmth, no connection. Slowly, the distance grew between us. My home, once filled with laughter and conversation, grew quiet. I would sit in the living room after dinner, the silence pressing down on me. The television played in the background, but it was only noise, not company. One evening, my wife came home later than usual. There was a coldness in her tone that I could not place. She spoke to me with minimal words, her eyes avoiding mine. I asked if everything was all right, and she said she was tired, that she had work. I did not press further. I wanted to believe it was temporary, that she was simply overwhelmed. But the truth was far heavier than exhaustion. The following weeks were harder. My children began to avoid me more openly. They stopped sharing details about their lives. They no longer asked how I was. I began to realize that the collapse of the company had changed something deep inside them. Perhaps they saw me differently now. Perhaps they thought I was no longer the man I had once been. The quiet avoidance was worse than words, for it was a sign that they were walking away without confrontation. One by one, they left. First my eldest, then my youngest, and finally my wife. Each departure was quiet, without explanation, without confrontation. They packed their belongings, said little, and left. I would return home to find the rooms empty, the air cold. Their laughter, once the heart of our home, was gone. I was left in a silence that seemed heavier than the collapse of my business. I sat in the empty house, surrounded by the echoes of the past. Every corner reminded me of the life we once had. I looked at old photographs, pictures of birthdays, family trips, and celebrations. I remembered the sound of my children's laughter and my wife's smile. Now, those memories felt like another lifetime, something I could never retrieve. The absence of my family taught me a painful lesson, that sometimes loss comes not in the form of bankruptcy, but in the slow erosion of love and presence. They had left me when I needed them most. They had chosen their own paths without a word to me. And in their silence, they had given me something worse than loneliness. They had given me the feeling of being unwanted. I walked through the empty rooms, touching the furniture they had left behind, the photographs still on the walls. Each step echoed like a reminder of my solitude. The house that had been my sanctuary now felt like a prison of memories. I wondered if they would ever return. I wondered if they even thought of me anymore. The truth was, I had no answers, only silence. It was in that silence that I began to sit with my thoughts. The collapse of my company had stripped away more than money. It had stripped away the foundation of my family. I realized that rebuilding my life would not be about reclaiming what I had lost in business, but about facing the emptiness that remained. I knew then that I was alone, truly alone, with nothing but the weight of what had been taken from me. After my family had gone, the house felt hollow. Every room carried an echo of what was lost. The laughter, the warmth, the shared moments, all of it gone. I would sit alone for hours in the living room, staring at the photographs that lined the walls. There were pictures of my father teaching me how to work with my hands, pictures of my wedding day, pictures of my children laughing at birthdays we celebrated, These images became my only company, yet they also carried pain. They reminded me of what I no longer had. I began to spend my nights wandering through those memories. I would sit at the old wooden table, staring into the dark, thinking of my father. He was a man of quiet strength, a man who had built his own life through hard work and sacrifice. I remembered his words, spoken long ago, about resilience and pride. "Life will take much from you," he once said, "but it will also give you something if you are willing to look for it." Those words came back to me now with heavier meaning. The emptiness in the house seemed to settle in my bones. There was no longer the noise of family life, no footsteps in the hall, no warm greetings in the morning. Instead, there was silence. Deep, unbroken silence. I would sometimes sit at the window for hours, watching as the seasons changed outside, as the sun rose and set, wondering if my own life had changed forever. I thought about what it meant to be abandoned, not just in the literal sense, but in the emotional one. To have loved ones walk away without explanation was a wound deeper than any financial loss. My heart was heavy with unanswered questions. Had I failed them? Had I not been enough? These thoughts visited me daily, uninvited, and I could not silence them. I began to revisit old habits of reflection. I would walk slowly to the small garden behind the house, touching the plants my children had once cared for. I thought about the years I had dedicated to building a home, to building a life for them. Every sacrifice, every moment of struggle had been for their future, and now that future had gone, leaving only absence behind. There were nights I found myself awake until dawn. In those hours of quiet, I would think of my father again. He had faced hardship too, I knew, though he never spoke much of it. I imagined him walking through this same emptiness, carrying burdens in silence. Perhaps that was why his voice had stayed with me for so long. Perhaps that voice was telling me that even in loss, there is a way forward. And so I began to speak to myself in that silence. I told myself that I must find something to hold on to, something that could bring meaning back to my life. It was not enough to grieve. I needed purpose again. I needed a reason to rise each day, but I did not yet know what that reason would be. The nights grew colder and the silence deeper. I would close my eyes and feel the weight of loss pressing on my chest. The memories became sharper, almost tangible. I remembered the warmth of my family, the sound of laughter, the touch of a hand in kindness. I remembered what it was to belong somewhere, and in that remembering, I began to understand that my journey was far from over. I knew I could not live in that house of memories forever. The emptiness demanded action. I could feel it in my bones. There was something I needed to do, something beyond grief and regret. But what was it? I did not know. All I had was the sound of my father's voice, whispering in my mind. Dig deeper, even when the ground feels empty. That voice stayed with me as the days passed. I began to look toward the cemetery where my father rested. I walked there often, seeking solace among the stillness. Each visit felt like a conversation, a silent communion with the man who had shaped me. I would stand by his grave for hours, touching the stone, letting my thoughts wander. And then, one morning, that voice returned, clear and simple. Dig under my grave. I could not understand it at first. It seemed like a dream, or perhaps a memory misplaced. But the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind. I woke early the next day, the voice still there, insistent. It was not anger, nor fear, but a strange pull, a feeling that I had to obey. I dressed quietly and walked to the cemetery before dawn. The air was cold and the mist hung low over the ground. The world was silent except for the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel path. I reached my father's grave, the stone weathered with time. My hands trembled as I placed them upon it. The voice was not gone. It was stronger now. I took a deep breath and began to dig. The soil was cold, heavy, and damp. Each scoop of earth felt like lifting years of memory. Neighbors passed by, curious, some shaking their heads at what they saw. I said nothing. My thoughts were consumed by the strange urgency in my chest, the sense that this was something I had to do. I kept digging in the cold, silent cemetery, the earth giving way slowly beneath my hands. The air smelled of damp soil and old stone, and my breath came out in white clouds. My back ached, but I could not stop. The voice in my mind was no longer a whisper. It was firm, almost commanding. It repeated itself, clearer now. Dig under my grave. I paused, wiping sweat and dirt from my face. My heart beat loudly in the still morning air. Was I dreaming? Was this grief twisting my mind? Yet the voice felt real, not imagined. It felt like my father speaking to me beyond death. I thought about the years I had known him, a man of few words but deep meaning. His life was one of discipline and foresight. Perhaps this was his final lesson. Around me, the cemetery remained silent. The early light of dawn touched the gravestones, making them glow softly. I glanced at my father's name etched into the stone, the letters worn smooth by time. They seemed to shimmer with something hidden, something I had never seen before. My hands trembled again, but I kept digging, each motion fueled by a strange determination. The ground grew harder the deeper I went. Roots tangled in the soil, pulling at my shovel, as if resisting my work. I thought of the years I had buried under my own burdens, the years of struggle, of loss, of silence. Now it felt like I was digging not just into the earth, but into my own life, into something my father had hidden away for reasons I could not yet understand. Hours passed, though I could not tell how many. The world beyond the graveyard seemed to fade. The only thing that existed was the sound of dirt falling, the scrape of my shovel, and the steady pull in my chest to keep going. Every breath became heavier. My hands bled, but I did not care. I was driven by something deeper than reason. Finally, the shovel struck something hard. My heart jumped. I knelt and cleared away the soil with my hands. Beneath the earth lay the edges of a metal box, corroded with age. My breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary grave. My father had hidden something here, something important. I looked around. The cemetery remained quiet, the mist curling low over the stones. I dragged the box free, my muscles aching from the effort. It was heavy, its weight pressing against my hands like the burden of years. The metal was rusted, but the lock seemed intact. I knelt there in the cold dawn and studied it. The air felt charged, as if I had crossed some threshold. Somewhere in my mind, I knew my life was about to change. I carried the box to a bench nearby, sitting with it on my knees. My fingers traced the worn edges, wondering what lay inside. My father had never spoken of secrets, yet this felt like one of his deepest truths. The voice that had guided me here was silent now, replaced by a strange stillness. I took a deep breath and opened the lock. Inside was a collection of objects that took my breath away. There were letters, carefully folded, tied with ribbons yellowed with age. There were property deeds, worn with time. And there was a small pouch of gold coins, their surface dull but heavy with value. My fingers trembled as I lifted the pouch. I could feel the weight of generations in my hands. The letters were the first thing I read. They were written in my father's hand, words flowing with care and purpose. They spoke of times I had never known, of struggles, sacrifices, and decisions made in silence. My father had kept these words for a reason. They told of a hidden fund, set aside for moments of great loss, a safety net for the future he could not live to see. Tears came to my eyes as I read. I thought of my own loss, of the collapse of my company, of my family walking away. All those years I had suffered, I had not realized that my father had prepared for such moments. His foresight, his silence, and his sacrifice were now mine to understand. I held the pouch of gold coins close to my heart. The weight of it was not just in the metal, but in the meaning. My father had left me more than money. He had left me hope, a chance to rise again. In that moment, I felt something I had not felt in years, a deep and quiet strength. I looked again at the letters. My father had written them for me, not to chastise, but to guide. They were his final words, a gift wrapped in mystery and silence. I realized that his grave had become more than a resting place. It had become a source of life, a message that even in death, love could speak. I sat there for hours, holding the box, reading the letters again and again. The cemetery was still, the morning light growing stronger. I felt no grief now, only a quiet resolve. I knew that my path was about to change, that I would rebuild, not for myself alone, but for the memory of my father's silent lesson. And so I left the grave, carrying the box with me. My steps were lighter now, my heart steadier. The voice was gone, but its meaning remained. I knew that what I had found beneath my father's grave was not just a treasure, but a call to live again. The morning air was cold and damp as I returned to the cemetery. The weight of what I had uncovered the night before still rested heavily on my shoulders. My mind was restless, circling over every word my father had written, every coin I had touched. But there was something pulling me back, something telling me that the story was not yet complete. I walked slowly among the gravestones, my breath visible in the chilly air. The cemetery was quiet, almost solemn, as if the stones themselves were watching. The paths were lined with frost, and every step I took crunched softly in the stillness. I felt both at peace and unsettled. There was a mystery here, deeper than the collapse of my company, deeper even than my own heartbreak. I approached my father's grave again, the metal box now in my bag. The stone was worn, moss clinging to its base. I knelt before it, tracing the engraved letters with my fingers. This grave had been silent for decades, holding secrets that only now had begun to speak to me. My father had chosen this place to leave his message, a message hidden beneath the soil, waiting for me to find. Around me, the cemetery was waking. A few mourners moved quietly among the stones, their heads bowed in private grief. The air smelled of damp earth and old flowers. I felt that the graveyard was alive with memory. Each stone held a story, and mine was about to unfold in a way I had never imagined. I sat on the edge of a stone bench, opening the metal box once more. The letters inside seemed to glow softly in the light. I had read them once, but I knew I would need to read them many times to understand fully. There was a calmness in that moment, a feeling that I had crossed into something sacred. My father's voice had guided me here, and now it was time to listen again. The sound of footsteps approached, breaking the quiet. A groundskeeper moved along the path, raking leaves and tending to the graves. He glanced at me briefly, offering no words. I nodded once, and he moved on. It was as if he understood that this was not a place for conversation, that something important was unfolding. I felt a strange kinship with him, both of us custodians of the dead, bound by silence. I rose slowly and looked at my father's gravestone. The morning light made the carved letters shine faintly. I felt a pull toward the earth beneath it. Something deep inside me urged me to return there, to dig again. My hands itched to work the soil, to uncover whatever else might be hidden. The voice had been silent since yesterday, but its message lingered. With a deep breath, I placed my hand on the stone. The air felt heavier here, as if the ground itself held its breath. I looked around once more before kneeling. My fingers found the earth, cold and damp, and I began to dig again. Every movement was slow, deliberate. The soil resisted me, roots tangling under the surface. Yet I kept going, driven by a sense that something important lay just beneath my reach. The world beyond the graveyard faded again. Time seemed to stretch and bend, and I was aware only of the rhythm of my work, the scrape of the shovel, the scent of the earth, the beating of my own heart. This was not just a grave I was digging. It was a place where the past and future met. My father's grave was not merely a resting place. It was a threshold to something greater. My hands grew sore, my back ached, but I did not stop. The earth was thicker now, heavier with the years of silence buried above it. I thought of all the times my father had been silent with me, teaching lessons without words. Perhaps this was his final lesson, to find patience, to persist, to uncover truth beneath hardship. Finally, my shovel struck something solid again. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt and began to clear the soil with my hands. The frost melted under my touch, revealing the edges of another hidden object. My heart pounded. Whatever lay beneath was meant to be found, and I was ready to face it. As the last layer of soil fell away, I saw it. Another box, smaller and older than the first. Its surface was covered in rust, and it seemed fragile with age. My fingers trembled as I lifted it free. The weight of it was strange, heavy not just with metal but with meaning. I placed it gently on the ground beside my father's grave and knelt beside it, my breath steadying in the cold morning air. I opened it slowly. Inside were more letters, faded photographs, and another pouch of coins, smaller than the first, but no less precious. The photographs were of my father in his youth, standing with men whose faces I did not recognize. The letters spoke of debts repaid, promises kept, and sacrifices made in silence. My father had lived a life of quiet duty. Tears welled in my eyes. I realized now that my father's grave was more than a resting place. It was a vault of lessons, a testament to his life and love. Everything he had kept hidden was not for himself, but for me. He had prepared for this moment, not just to protect me, but to teach me about resilience and trust. I sat back, the morning light warming my shoulders. Around me, the graveyard remained silent, but my heart was loud with understanding. My father's voice, though absent, was clear in my mind. There is always hope beneath the earth. You must dig for it. I closed the box carefully, feeling a deep peace settle in me. I rose, brushing the soil from my hands. The voice was silent now, but its message was etched into my soul. I knew my path forward had been found, and it began here, at my father's grave. The metal box felt cold in my hands, as though it carried not only the weight of the earth, but also the weight of decades of silence. I placed it on a flat stone nearby and looked around the graveyard once more. The air was still. The world paused, as if waiting for me to open it. My breath came slow and steady. I knew the moment had come. Carefully, I lifted the lid. A faint creak echoed, soft but certain. Inside, the contents lay arranged with a strange precision, as if my father had placed them there knowing exactly who would find them. There were yellowed letters tied with twine, brittle with age. Beneath them was a small pouch, worn and patched, that seemed to hum with history. The letters were the first I took in hand. Their edges crumbled slightly under my touch. I unfolded the first one and read slowly. The handwriting was my father's, steady, deliberate, and full of purpose. He had written to me without knowing I would read his words years later. Each line carried the weight of years of sacrifice and deep understanding of life's trials. One letter told of debts my father had quietly settled for the family without my knowledge. Another spoke of a secret fund, a sum of money hidden for emergencies, stored away under the grave itself. He had planned for the worst long before I ever imagined such trials. My eyes began to sting as I read, each word deepening my understanding of his foresight. The pouch of coins was next. Its leather surface was soft with age, worn from being held in careful hands. I opened it slowly, revealing gold coins that caught the morning light. They were old, minted decades before my birth, but their shine still carried value. I counted them silently, each coin a token of my father's care, a safeguard for a future I thought was lost. There were also photographs, yellowed with time. I studied them carefully. They showed my father standing beside men I did not know, in places I had never seen. Some pictures were of him younger, with a look of resolve in his eyes that matched the tone of his letters. It was as if he was telling me through these images the story of a man who lived quietly, but with great purpose. I placed the photographs aside and examined the remaining letters. They were written to people I did not know, but their words were not just personal. They were lessons. My father spoke of patience, of humility, of preparing for times of hardship without letting pride guide his choices. It was clear now that his burial site was not just a grave. It was a place of teaching. The final letter was folded carefully at the bottom of the box. I opened it with trembling hands. The words were simple, but carried the deepest meaning. Son, life will take much from you, When it does, remember where to look. Dig beneath what is lost, and you will find what is needed. My eyes filled with tears. My father had left me not just coins and papers, but his philosophy of life. Around me, the morning light grew stronger. The graveyard seemed to breathe softly, the air warm with memory. I closed the box gently, feeling the weight of what I had found settle in my chest. My father had given me something beyond measure. I had found more than money. I had found a legacy, proof that love and preparation could outlive even loss. The silence was deep as I rose to my feet. I placed the box beside the gravestone, as if returning a gift to its rightful resting place. I understood then that this discovery was not just about rebuilding my life. It was about honoring my father's foresight, his care, and his final lesson. With steady hands, I brushed away the last bits of earth. The grave looked as it always had, but I now knew it held more than memory. Beneath it lay a story of resilience, of quiet sacrifice, of faith that a son would one day need what a father could leave behind. I stood there for a long moment, the box at my feet, letting the weight of the discovery sink in. My life had been broken, my family scattered, my company lost. But here, in the quiet of this graveyard, I had found not only my father's secret, but a path forward. The thought gave me strength. I would rebuild, not only for myself, but in honor of the man who had taught me that hope could be buried in the soil and waiting to be uncovered. I turned slowly from the grave. The path ahead felt certain now, shaped by the words of my father and the treasure hidden beneath his resting place. Every step I took was steadier than before, and as I left the graveyard behind, I knew I carried with me a lesson that could never be taken away, a truth that would guide me for the rest of my days. The moment I closed the box, I felt a quiet shift inside me. My father's words lingered in my mind, and I realized I had unearthed not only gold and letters, but also a truth that would change everything. I returned home slowly, carrying the box with care. The air felt different, charged with purpose. Every step I took reminded me of the weight I now bore, not of sorrow, but of responsibility. At home, I placed the box on the old wooden table in my study. The letters lay open beside the coins, and I studied them again with calm determination. It was then that I began to understand the depth of my father's foresight. He had lived through hardship and prepared for loss in a way that only a man who truly cared could. Every word in those letters was deliberate, every coin a testament to quiet sacrifice. He had given me a plan, a guide for times when all seemed lost. I began to piece together the puzzle. My father had anticipated that life might strip away everything I built. He had known that my company might fail, that people could leave, and that my world could collapse. His instructions were not just for survival, they were for renewal. There was more than money in that box. There was a map of his thinking. In his letters, he spoke of resilience, of keeping one's dignity even when stripped bare. He reminded me that what truly mattered was not wealth, but the strength to begin again. The gold coins were a start. They would allow me to pay debts, to find a foundation on which to rebuild. But the letters, those words, were the real inheritance. They gave me something greater, wisdom. I contacted my lawyer quietly that evening. I wanted to understand the legal side of what my father had left behind. The documents in the box confirmed it. There was enough to start again, enough to recover more than I had lost. The truth unfolded slowly. My father had not left me charity. He had left me an inheritance of courage. The money was a tool, but the lesson was priceless. It was the knowledge that even in the darkest times, there was a way forward. I began to plan. The collapse of my company had left me with nothing but memories. Now I had a reason to look forward, a path I had never thought possible after such loss. I would not waste this gift. I wrote letters of my own that night, not of complaint, but of gratitude. To my father, to the man who had seen the storms ahead and prepared for them. I wrote that I would honor his legacy, not just with rebuilding, but by living with the strength he had taught me. The days that followed were filled with action. I called in favors, reopened old connections, and began laying the groundwork for a new chapter. Every decision was guided by what I had learned at my father's grave. As I worked, I felt the truth settle deeper in my heart. This was more than an inheritance of wealth. It was the proof that even after betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, there could be redemption. My family had left me when I was broken. My company had failed. But beneath my father's grave lay proof that loss is never final if one is willing to dig deeper. That truth gave me strength beyond measure. I knew now that rebuilding was not just about reclaiming what was gone, but about finding something stronger than before, a purpose born of hardship and guided by wisdom. I kept the letters close, reading them often. They became my guidebook, my moral compass. They reminded me daily that the treasure my father left was not buried only in the earth, but in the courage to rise again. In time, I began to share my discovery quietly with those I trusted. The story of what lay beneath my father's grave became a lesson I passed on, not for wealth, but for the courage to endure. I realized then that truth has its own power. The gold could be spent, the letters could fade, but the truth of what I found would never diminish. It had become a part of me, shaping every choice I made from that day forward. And so I began again. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had been given more than I ever asked for. My father's last gift was not money. It was the truth that loss is only the beginning of another journey. I stepped into the days ahead carrying that truth. The world felt different now, not because everything was restored, but because I knew I could restore myself. In the end, I understood what my father meant. To dig beneath what is lost is to find the strength to rebuild, and sometimes the most valuable discoveries lie beneath the graves we least expect. I looked once more at the grave before I turned away. Beneath it lay not only my inheritance, but my future. My father had left me a roadmap for life, written in silence and buried with love. When I woke the next morning, I felt the weight of what I had discovered under my father's grave. It was not just a discovery of gold and papers, but of a new life waiting to be built. The collapse of my company had been a cruel lesson, but now I had the tools and the wisdom to transform that lesson into opportunity. I began by making a list, not of what I had lost, but of what I could still build. I wrote down every idea that came to mind, every small step that could lead me back to stability. This was my first act of rebuilding, a mental blueprint. The gold coins from my father's grave became the first bricks of that blueprint. They would cover my debts, pay for a modest office, and give me a starting point to rebuild. But I knew it was not enough to just spend money. I needed vision. I called a few old colleagues quietly. They were surprised to hear from me after months of silence. I told them I wanted to begin again, humbly and patiently. Many responded with encouragement. Some offered help. Others simply wished me luck. That was enough for me. I rented a small office space, enough to house a few employees and run my operations. It was humble compared to the grandeur of my company before, but I welcomed it as a fresh start. The past would no longer define me. I would define my future. I used my father's letters as a guide for every decision. They reminded me that rebuilding was not just about financial stability, but about resilience, honesty, and patience. My father's voice seemed to whisper in my mind every time I faced a challenge. As the weeks passed, I began to rebuild not just my company, but my confidence. Every small success, a signed contract, a happy client, a completed project, became a reminder that the collapse had not been the end. It was a turning point. I reached out to old friends and business partners, explaining my new vision. Some laughed at first, remembering my past misfortunes, but others saw sincerity in my words and agreed to help. It was a slow process, but every connection mattered. One evening, as I worked late in my small office, I realized something important. Rebuilding was not just about regaining what I lost, but about creating something stronger, built on wisdom rather than pride. My father had given me more than gold. He had given me the strength to transform pain into purpose. I began to focus on building something that could last, something my children could respect, even if they had walked away from me. I wanted my story to be more than one of loss. I wanted it to be a lesson in perseverance. Every night, I reread my father's letters. His words became my mantra. Strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to begin again. Those letters shaped not just my business plans, but my life. I hired a small but dedicated team. Each person knew I was starting from nothing, but they believed in my vision. Together, we began to work toward something modest but real, a company built on integrity. Months passed, and the small office became a hive of quiet but steady work. I no longer measured success in millions, but in stability, trust, and growth. My father's voice reminded me that patience is often the greatest power of all. I never sought publicity for my return. This rebuilding was private, deliberate. I wanted it to be mine, without the noise of others' judgments. It was about restoring myself, not proving myself to anyone else. The gold coins dwindled slowly as they were put to use. But with each expense came a lesson. Every dollar spent was a step toward something greater than wealth. It was a step toward reclaiming my dignity. I began to see change not just in my business, but in myself. The man who once thought he needed everything to be respected now knew respect came from endurance, humility, and integrity. I worked every day with a quiet sense of purpose. I no longer feared loss because I understood the lesson buried beneath it. My father had taught me that the greatest inheritance is not riches, but wisdom. I decided to keep my story private for a long time. Only those who needed encouragement would hear it. But deep inside, I knew the truth. My father's grave had given me a future when everything else was gone. I was no longer the man who had lost everything. I was the man who had found his way back from the edge, guided by a voice from the past and the courage to begin again. In time, I began to dream again, not of grandeur, but of stability, peace, and a legacy of quiet strength. The collapse of my company had been a chapter, not the end of the book. I found a deeper peace in my rebuilding. I was not chasing lost glory, but building something real, something my father would have been proud of, and so I worked. Not for wealth, not for revenge, but for the quiet satisfaction of rebuilding a life worth living. My father had buried more than gold beneath his grave. He had buried hope, and he had entrusted it to me. Now, as an old man, I sit quietly and tell this story, not to boast, but to remind those who listen that life will test you in ways you cannot imagine. I have learned that the hardest battles often come when the ground beneath you falls away, leaving nothing but darkness. My company collapsed, my family left me, and for months I lived in silence, wondering if I would ever rise again. The bitterness of those days remains with me, but it is no longer the strongest feeling in my heart. The strongest feeling is gratitude for the lesson my father gave me. When the voice came to me in the quiet of the night, telling me to dig beneath my father's grave, I thought I was losing my mind. But I was desperate for hope, and desperation often listens to things the mind would otherwise reject. That grave was not just a resting place for my father, it was a vault of wisdom, a bridge between loss and redemption. Beneath it, my father had buried something that transcended wealth. He had buried trust, foresight, and a silent message that life always offers a second chance. As I dug, layer after layer of earth falling away, I felt the weight of my life's journey press down on me. Every hardship, every betrayal, every sleepless night seemed to be leading to this moment of discovery. My father's voice, clear and patient, guided my hands. The moment I opened the box, I did not see gold coins first. I saw letters written in my father's careful hand. They were words filled with advice, warnings, and encouragement. They told me not to measure life by possessions, but by the strength to rise when all else is lost. That day, I realized rebuilding was not merely about recovering what I had lost. It was about creating something stronger than before, something forged in humility and perseverance. My father had not just given me money, he had given me the courage to begin again. I used that courage to start over. I built a smaller, quieter company, one without pretensions, but with a purpose. I learned to measure success not in wealth, but in stability, respect, and the ability to keep going when others have turned away. In rebuilding, I found peace. I no longer chased approval. I no longer measured myself by possessions or applause. I measured myself by the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had endured. My father's grave had become a symbol of that endurance. I think often about the night I heard the voice. It was not just a command. It was a call to transformation. My father knew I would falter. He knew I would need something tangible to show me that even in loss, there is a way forward. The gold was enough to give me a new start, but it was the letters that built the foundation. They reminded me that life's most valuable inheritance is not money, but wisdom. The wisdom to understand that failure is not the end, but a beginning. As I grew older, I came to understand that the voice was my father's way of teaching me resilience. It was a final lesson, buried beneath the earth, waiting for the day I could truly understand it. That lesson was, never give up, no matter how deep the loss. Now I share this story because I know there are others who stand in the shadow of loss, wondering if they will ever see light again. I want them to know that the voice of hope can come from the most unexpected places, sometimes from beneath the grave of your past. My company may have collapsed, my family may have left me, but under my father's grave, I found a future. And in that future, I found peace. A peace born not of wealth regained, but of lessons learned and a heart rebuilt. I learned that life does not promise smooth roads. It promises trials, tests, and moments where you must choose between giving up and beginning again. My choice was to begin again, quietly, without fanfare. There is no greater gift a father can give than the wisdom to stand alone and the courage to build something new. My father gave me both. His grave was not just the end of his life, but the beginning of mine. Now, when I walk past his resting place, I do not feel sorrow. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for a life lesson that no collapse could erase. Gratitude for a voice that came in the darkness and told me where to dig. In the quiet of my old age, I realized that the voice was not just my father's. It was life speaking through him. Life telling me that even in the deepest despair, there is something worth fighting for. So now I say to those who hear my story, listen to the quiet voice within. Even when the world turns away, even when all seems lost, there is a way forward. It may not be the way you planned, but it can be a way that rebuilds your soul. I have lived long enough to understand that what we lose can never fully be regained, but what we gain through rebuilding, courage, wisdom, and peace, is far greater. My father's grave became my guide, my gold became my seed, and my rebuilding became my legacy. I carry it with me every day, and I share it so that others might find their own path in the dark. Final thought. My company collapsed, my family left, but under my father's grave, I found a future, and in that future, I found peace.